Hi, I'm Maria, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Welcome to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. My name is Siddhant Wadera, and I am the production manager for The Main Page, our podcast on policy, politics, and current affairs. Today, we are kicking off our 5th season with the first installment of a mini-series on the Supreme Court, democracy, and election law. You'll hear Andrew Wise interview NYU law professor Samuel Isacharoff about the role the Supreme Court has played in shaping American democracy. 3 quick notes before we begin. First, this episode was recorded remotely due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Second, we re-recorded some of Andrew's questions for clarity. Finally, this interview was conducted before Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, so we don't touch upon the future of the court. Without further ado, here's Professor Samuel Isacharoff.
Hello, I'm Andrew Wise with the UCC 3P Main Page mini-series about the U.S. Supreme Court, election law, and democracy. We are honored to be joined today by Samuel Isacharoff, the Bonnie and Richard Reese Professor of Law at NYU. He specializes in constitutional law with a particular focus on voting and elections. Professor Isacharoff, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
I want to start today with a big picture question. What do you see as the relationship between courts and democracy, such as what is the role of courts in a democracy?
Well, that's a very hard question to start with. The very nature of democracy is that the people get to choose, and the government that they choose should be responsive to the policy preferences of the people. No system can work on that basis. It needs constraints. It needs the majority can't oppress the minority. The majority can't cancel elections. The majority can't decide that this is the final election and there will be no more. And so you need an overlay of rules that limit what the majority can do. One of the ways I express this is that the heart of democracy is that the majority should prevail, but not too much. And the role of the courts comes in on the not too much side. Courts are, particularly in the United States, but this is now spread all over the world, courts are the enforcers of the constitutional overlay over what the Democratic majority can do. And in the United States, over the past 50, 60 years, we've seen a constantly expanding role for the courts under the name of the Constitution, occasionally under the name of some of our more important election-related statutes, such as the Voting Rights Act or the various campaign finance laws.
Thank you for your thoughts on that issue, which ties well into my next question. You've written before about the role of the courts in safeguarding democracy, such as from populist or authoritarian uprisings, or politicians seeking to undermine electoral accountability. Could you talk a little about why courts need to be the institutions that do that?
Well, let me start by saying, before I get to what they do, it doesn't always have to be courts. In the United States, it tends to be courts. In the United States, we tend to litigate many questions of social dispute that are not litigated elsewhere. In some countries, there are special electoral institutions, basically governing boards of the elections, that play that role. In some countries, Mexico is the best example. You have specialized election courts that handle just the electoral disputes. So it doesn't have to be the way we do it in the United States, but basically in most countries it is some adjunct of the courts. Now let me get to the heart of the question. The key to democracy is what in game theory is called repeat play. That is, I have to believe that today I might win or I might lose. And if I win today, I might lose tomorrow. And so as long as there is uncertainty and there's competition, the various sides will try to find a way to achieve their policy objectives, but also not open up too much for radical change in the future. And so democracy with a healthy level of political competition tends to be a pretty stable political way of governance. What happens in moments of crisis or when moments that a part of the population thinks this is the decisive moment, I cannot live with the other side prevailing, is that what game theorists would call repeat play turns into one-shot play, turns into this is it. Either I win, I lose, everything's on the table, there will be no tomorrow. And at that point, all the rules of democratic reciprocity break down. They break down in the legislative chamber where there's no longer respect given to the way things have been done historically. They break down, let me give you two examples in the United States. In recent elections in North Carolina and in Wisconsin, there was a change in party that controlled the governorship. It went from being Republican to Democratic, and the legislature remained Republican for a period of time. The first thing the Republicans tried to do after losing the gubernatorial election before the new governor took office was to change the definition of the rules of what a governor could do. How many board appointments, how big a budget, how big a staff, in order to try to denude the office of its historic capacity. That's a change in the rules which cannot be tolerated by any democratic system. And so the role of the courts is to come in and make sure that the ground rules are stable, that the ground rules are honored, that there not be disruption of political opponents, that there not be the illicit use of public monies to fund the incumbent party, things of that sort. And so the role that the courts play is as the guarantors of the level playing field, because at the end of the day, it's a question of foxes guarding the henhouse. You don't want incumbents who've been elected to be able to alter rules in ways that will favor them.
That makes a lot of sense. It does seem that they often do that. Now, as far as the court goes, the U.S. Supreme Court has sometimes fulfilled its role as defender of voting rights, but not always. Would you say that the middle of the 20th century was the heyday, so to speak, of the court in defending democracy? And can you talk about the regression of the court since that time?
Well, I wouldn't say the middle of the 20th century, because the middle of the 20th century was a period where we had the complete disenfranchisement of the Black population in the South of the United States. I would say that the court came into its own in the early 1960s in a series of rulings having to do with gerrymandering and malapportioned districts. And in these cases, the court rejected a historic doctrine, what had been called the political question doctrine, that basically said, you don't touch anything that has to do with the political process. You can handle individual rights claims, but you can't do anything structural in the political process. And beginning in the 1960s, the court took on the malapportionment of congressional districts, the state legislative districts, and basically opened up the broadest democratic expansion in the United States. Second phase was following the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The court very aggressively enforced minority access to the franchise, first in the capacity to register, which was actually the easiest part, it turned out. Congress thought it would be the hardest part. And then in challenging some of the latent practices that over-reward majorities in elections and under-reward minorities, such as multi-member districts, or what's called at-large election, in which instead of breaking up elections into multiple districts where a group has a chance of being a majority in one of the sub-districts, you run all the elections across the entire jurisdiction, which allows the majority to prevail across all the different positions. And in the context of what is called technically racially polarized voting, which means simply that blacks vote one way and whites vote the other, what you get is all white boards, even in jurisdictions that were heavily black. The court was very aggressive in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, through the 1990s in breaking up these kinds of monopolistic lockholds that particularly white Southerners held over black voting aspirations. I think that the court is more conservative now, obviously, than it has been, but its approach to voting is actually quite interventionist still, and it is highly protective of what it sees to be the fundamental principles at stake. And these are, as we move away from simply questions of can you cast a ballot, these are more socially freighted, difficult questions. So, for example, on the question of campaign finance, there is both a liberty and equality strain to American constitutional law. The court tips more heavily toward the liberty strain, which is that everybody should have the right to spend money to speak, even if the amount that they can contribute to any individual candidate can be limited. Whereas the more liberal side of the court tends to be concerned about disparities in access and disparities in wealth. And so you get tension there. But I think that the court is highly attentive to the political process. And I would just add one element to this. In the aftermath of the Florida 2000 election, where the court intervened, Supreme Court, in the Bush versus Gore case, courts have been very liberal, and I use that term not in the liberal conservative political split, but very liberal in allowing litigants to come into court to challenge the fundamentals of how the election process is working. And people have different political views on this, and there may be differences in how one assesses the outcomes. But I don't think the court has ever gone back to its pre-1960s view that this is all a matter that should be left to the political process to police itself.
We were getting at this a bit, but in terms of voting access and ability to cast a ballot, politicians have historically tried, in many ways, to prevent disfavored groups of voters from casting ballots. Nominally, African American men gained the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, but as you were just alluding to, few in practice could vote for the next century, especially in the South. Can you elaborate on what role the court played in allowing that to happen?
Well, the disenfranchisement of Black Americans is the great shame of the post-Civil War period. The constitutional theory at the time divided the world between political and civil rights, and the 14th Amendment guaranteed to the freed slaves, former slaves, the capacity to engage in contract, to work, the various civil rights, what's called equal protection and due process, and privileges and immunities of citizenship. The 15th Amendment was subsequent, and it guaranteed one of the major political rights, the other being jury, right to participate in the jury. And the guarantee of the franchise to the freedmen was actually tremendously significant and successful. Federal marshals went to the South. There were new ways of bringing these cases into federal court if there were deprivations of the franchise. And for a period of about 20 years, you had extensive Black enfranchisement throughout the South. You had Blacks elected to every level of office. And then you had the reaction to this, the redemption period, as it was called in the South, the rise of Jim Crow. And basically in a 10, 15-year period through